Hello everyone, can you hear me okay? Yes. So this is modern, interactive and impactful software documentation. I'm Ghislain Vaillant, your speaker. I'm an RSC at INRIA Paris. And I think a lot of you have written code and documentation to some extent. It's just that recently I wanted to reflect on this question, which is how to write good software documentation. So really the craft of writing quality documentation that maximizes impact. So you see that I've emphasized a few words. How means that I'm going to be focused on the theoretical groundings of how documentation works, good with a certain level of quality, and I'll be focused specifically on software documentation, although some of the discoveries will be applicable to other kind of documentation. So I'll start with presenting the framework that will serve the theoretical groundings of a documentation called Diátaxis. Then I will present you what I would call a modern document project setup using Sphinx and MyST. And I'll finish with a few tips on the tooling and automation to add on it. So let's start with Diátaxis. So Diátaxis is actually a very simple framework proposed by Daniele Procida, who used to be an SSI fellow, if I remember. Now he's director of engineering at Canonical. And he proposed to formalize the domain of crafting within two axes. So the horizontal axis is going to be focused on the practice aspect, and the vertical axis on the knowledge aspect. So left would be everything that is when you're in study mode. Right would be everything that's focused on work mode. Bottom would be everything focused on knowing what, and up would be everything about knowing how. And then you can project all the type of documentation on them, and you can categorize each documentation based on what they cover. So we have tutorials, we have how-to guides, which I will use cookbook because it's usually the term that's mostly used, reference and explanation. And something to keep in mind is that although the boundaries are clear here, the aim is still that your practitioners, your users, they will approach documentation from different needs. So they will introduce themselves to documentation through different doors. And your aim is to make sure that you have references throughout all your piece of documentation so that they can cover part or whole of your documentation through their learning journey. So for instance, we can take, if they come with the need to develop practical knowledge, this is served by both tutorials and cookbook, whereas theoretical knowledge would be served by reference and explanation. And often if you find yourself reading some piece of documentation and being a bit frustrated, thinking, oh, there's maybe too much information or it didn't quite click, it's because most likely there were overlapping needs covered by the piece of documentation you are reading. And the framework really expresses the distinctive concerns between these types of documentations. So for instance, if we take tutorials, the guidance to the author is to design it as lesson-oriented. And the expectations to the reader is going to be that the reader is going to be taught, is going to be led by a lesson, and going to feel educated at the end. Whereas for a cookbook, you will design it in a goals-oriented fashion, so we have a set of steps to follow, and there will be a sense of achievement for that goal at the end. All right, so now I'll move on to the modern documentation project with Sphinx and MyST. To get started, I've reminded you the steps to set up a Sphinx project. The only addition to get MyST support is to install the MyST parser, enable it in your configuration, and then you can start editing all your documentation in Markdown file instead of restructured text. MyST Markdown is basically a superset of Common Mark, so it's Common Mark plus MyST roles and directives. A role is an inline directive. So directive names are between curly brackets, and then the content being concerned by the directive is in backticks. And a directive is a proper Markdown block with the name of the directive, some positional argument, some key value optional parameters, and the actual content that goes in that block. So for instance, the example at the bottom is to make a warning box. MyST supports some additional syntax enhancements that can be enabled through extensions. I advise you to use the colon fence one, which allows you to switch the backtick block markdown syntax to this triple colon. What that does is that in your editor, if the content of the block is in Markdown, it will be rendered in Markdown instead of like a blend block, which is very useful, for instance, for tables where there's Markdown content in it or in info boxes. Regular Sphinx extensions work as well and can be used with MyST Markdown. So here, for instance, if you want to inline a mermaid flowchart, you can install the Sphinx extension, enable it, and then use it with the mermaid directive here to get this very simple flowchart rendered in your documentation. Another thing, so if you want to generate reference documentation, which was one part of the 4-quadrant I showed you earlier, usually the way it's done is we put this content in docstrings in the package, and then we auto-generate it by Sphinx. This is done with the Sphinx Auto API extension, which needs a few parameters that I've put at the bottom. And this will automatically parse your code base and compose the HTML pages for your reference documentation. And unlike the Autodoc extension, that's usually the one that you would see advertised, it doesn't rely on package imports, which means that you don't need to install your full package with a full set of dependencies. It would just parse the documentation, and that's it. You can enable literate programming with MyST notebooks. So instead of using Jupyter notebooks, which are saved in JSON files and very tricky to review if you version it, you can basically turn these Jupyter notebooks into MyST Markdown notebooks. You need the MyST-NB extension, and that way you can you can use this code block directive that will replace the actual cells that you had in a Jupyter notebook in IPyNB format. And then you can turn them to become interactive when you browse the documentation with the Sphinx Phoebe extension. And that way you can link your documentation to Binder, and you get access to the Phoebe button directive to launch. When you load the documentation, launch the Binder kernel. And then you can annotate your code blocks with the class Phoebe parameter, and that turns that to an executable cell that can be edited online and re-executed on the fly. I'll move on to some tips on tooling and automation. So the initial setup phase would be the regular one, bootstrap your Sphinx project with Sphinx Quick Start. You can use Sphinx Auto Build to set up interactive editing, which is quite nice if you want to edit the documentation on the fly and get it rebuilt as you get modifications in. And use a separate group for documentation dependencies. So consider your documentation as a separate project or sub-project within your Python package, and really put all these documentation dependencies on the side so that they don't pollute the rest of your environment. Also consider providing maintenance commands for your documentation that eases the contribution from your community. You can do it through regular make files. I personally use a project manager called Hatch, on which you can specify the environment you want to deploy specifically for the documentation, and a set of commands. Here, one to build, one to serve the interactive documentation, and one to clean everything. And use the read the docs or GitLab pages or self-hosting, eventually with a custom domain if your project takes traction, because we never know when one of these services is going to be enshittified eventually. And if you use read the docs, it's really just like this set of lines to get it deployed. So this is my last slide. My takeaways are the following. So if you want to apply these recommendations today, start by studying Diátaxis to understand how to raise your documentation's impact. Use Sphinx and MyST for a modern and interactive experience, and don't hesitate to invest time and efforts in automation and maintenance setup. Thank you very much, and I'll take some questions.
Thank you very much. So if I just switch over to Canopy, so we do not yet have your questions on Canopy. Please do connect to Canopy and add questions there, but in the meantime, I will ask. So I know that Sphinx is really good if you've got inline documentation in your code. It's good at producing things like reference documentation that can stay in sync with your code, because when you're editing your code, you spot that the documentation needs to be updated. How do you keep, is there tooling, or is there something you can use to keep your tutorial documentation up to date in the same way? Because it's very easy for tutorial documentation to get out of sync because you forget about it when you're touching the code.
So for that, there's, I would say, two examples that I choose. So either you go the NumPy, SciPy route, where they basically put everything in the doc strings, and they have very little decoration on the documentation part. That means that your code files will be quite heavy in documentation, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. The other option, if you're using tutorials, and especially if you're using the notebooks, you can get the tool chain to actually re-execute your notebooks as part of your CI setup. So that way, when you build the documentation, the actual cells are executed, and if there is an error, your CI will fail, and you would have to fix the documentation. So in my current project, that's exactly how I'm doing it. And I think if you're using Jupyter Book, it does it by default.
Right. Thank you. So Peter Hill asks, why prefer MyST over RST?
So it's a good question. My experience with programmers, but mostly researchers, is they are more familiar with Markdown in general rather than restructured text, and the syntax, in my opinion, is a little bit more user-friendly, although less flexible if you're offering more complicated documents like books or workshop material, for instance.
Okay, thank you. And in the interests of keeping the session running to time, I'll suggest anyone who has questions, there's a couple of questions that just come in the last few seconds, come and speak to Ghislaine in the coffee break. So let's thank Ghislaine again.